Good morning and welcome to Wisdom of the World. Today's story is a second story from the Arabian Nights. I did want to share one of the stories of the voyages of Sinbad the sailor. This is his second voyage and it's called The Mythical Bird. And it goes like this. After living quietly for a few years, I began to long for some adventure. So I bought some cloth to sell, found a ship and paid the captain to take me on board. We sailed away from port to port and island to island, further and further from home. For a whole week we sailed across an empty sea. Then one day we came to an island. The captain dropped anchor and we all went ashore. It was a beautiful island, covered in trees and fragrant flowers. There was a little stream running into the sea, which I decided to follow inland to see what I could find. Along the banks of the stream grew bushes with soft orange fruit that flocks of quick little birds were eating. I gathered the fruit as I walked and sat down beneath the tree to enjoy it. The fruit was juicy and delicious. After I'd eaten, I felt drowsy, so I lay back in the dappled shade, and very soon I fell fast asleep. When I awoke, the shadows were long and the light was fading. I'd been asleep for hours. I hurried back to the shore, but it was empty. I peered out to the horizon, and there was my ship, tiny and golden in the low afternoon sun. It was sailing away without me. I waved and yelled, but it was no use. It was gone for good. There was no point sitting there feeling sorry for myself, so I decided to climb the tallest tree I could find and see what I could see. I did this, and when I poked my head out of the upper branches, I saw the whole island. In the middle, emerging from the treetops, was a huge white dome. It was vast, bigger than any building I'd ever seen. There must be people here, I thought excitedly. I climbed down and set off to find the dome. Close up, it was even more amazing. The surface was smooth and white with no signs of any brickwork, and the walls were perfectly curved without edges or corners. They must be very clever to have built this, I thought to myself. I couldn't see any windows or doors, so I walked around the building to find a way in. I arrived back where I started without finding anything. Could it be that the doorway is hidden? Or that there is no way in, I wondered? Suddenly, everything went dark. I looked up to see a giant shadow in the sky above me, blotting out the sun. It grew bigger and bigger until it filled the entire sky. It was the biggest bird I'd ever seen, and it was coming into land. I dived for cover as the bird flew down. Dust billowed up and the tray swayed under its giant flapping wings. The creature landed with its huge scaly feet either side of the white dome and settled down on top of it. I glared around for a moment and I shrank into the shadows, my heart thumping with fear. Without appearing to notice me, the great bird closed its eyes and went to sleep. I was astounded. As a child, I'd heard stories of a mythical bird called a roc that was supposed to be as big as a ship, but I'd never believed them to be true. There I was, standing right next to one, feeling like the tiniest ant next to a vulture. Of course, the huge white dome that the roc was sitting on wasn't a building, it was an egg. While the creature slept, I thought about what to do. It's no use me staying on this island all alone, I reasoned. It could be years before a ship sails by. This bird must fly to other places. If I could go with it, I might find some way home. Night had fallen by the time I had decided on a plan. I unwrapped my turban and tied one end around my chest. Creeping up to the bird, I knotted the other end around its thick, scaly leg. Then I sat down and waited. An ear-splitting screech awoke me at dawn. The bird stood up, flapped its giant wings, and took flight. The turban pulled tight around my chest, and in a moment I too was airborne. We flew up and up and up into the sky and out over the sparkling sea. Dangling from the rock's leg, I could see all the way to the horizon. There wasn't a scrap of land in sight. I began to panic. This was a stupid idea, I thought. If it lands in the water, I'll drown. I glanced at the flapping monster above me. I was completely at its mercy. I closed my eyes and prayed for dear life. Suddenly, the bird let out a piercing cry and began to descend. I opened my eyes to see that we were plummeting towards an island. I'm going to die, I thought. But the rock landed on a sandy slope and I tumbled down unhurt. With trembling fingers, I hurriedly untied my turban and scrambled away from the bird. But as I turned, I ran straight into a massive, scaly obstacle. Hiss, it said. Two cold yellow eyes stared down at me and a forked tongue flickered in and out of a fearsome set of jaws. I had come face to face with a giant snake. Before I could think what to do, the rock reached over my head, seized the snake in its beak and took flight. I watched the giant snake writhing in the giant bird's beak as it flew away. Then, breathing a shuddering sigh of relief, I looked around to see where I had landed. I was on a steep sandy slope leading down into a valley, the bottom of which I couldn't see. There was no vegetation anywhere, only sand and rocks. All around me towered sheer, craggy mountains that no man could ever climb. I'd been better off staying where there was food and water, I sighed. There was no other way to go but further down into the valley. So down I went, trudging through the stones to see what I could find. As I walked, I noticed a strange glow coming from the bottom of the valley. And when I went a little further, I saw what it was coming from. The valley floor was littered with diamonds. They glittered and sparkled in the sunlight. There were so many, and these shone so brightly I could barely look. I wanted to run to them, but stopped in my tracks, because slithering over the gems were more giant snakes than I could count. I can't go up, and I can't go down. I said to myself, what am I to do now? I sat down on a large rock to think. As I watched, I realized that the snakes were disappearing into various dark caves and crevices in the sides of the valley. They don't like sunlight, I realized. When they had all found hiding places, I crept down onto the valley floor. The diamonds crunched under my feet and sparkled bright whites with twinkling rainbows in them. It was the most beautiful sight. I knelt down, dug my hands into them and let them trickle through my fingers. I may never get out of here alive, I thought, but you never know. And so I filled all my pockets with the precious gems. The sun was hot and I was hungry and thirsty. In one of my pockets, I found some fruit from the previous island, which I devoured. Then I began to search for a way out of the steep valley. I walked carefully around the edges of it, peering into dark caves, which each one contained a giant snake whose sleeping hisses made my hair stand on end. I had to find a way out by nightfall somehow, or I was sure to die. Several hours passed, and eventually I flung myself down on the diamonds in despair. But as I lay there, gazing hopelessly at the twinkling stones, something landed with a thump right next to me. I looked up to see a huge hunk of meat the size of a whole sheep lying there. I scrambled to my feet as another hunk of meat landed, and looked up to seeing more being hurled into a valley from the mountains above. Whatever could it mean? Then suddenly cries filled the air, and many giant eagles and vultures appeared in the sky above me. They weren't as big as the rock, but they were certainly larger by far than any ordinary birds. One by one, the giant eagles began to dive into the valley. They seized the pieces of meat in their talons and flew up again with them. As they grasped the meat, they took with them talons full of sparkling gems. They flew over the cliff tops, and loud claps of gunfire sounded. In fright, the birds dropped the meat and the diamonds on the cliff tops and flew away. But they soon returned to the valley for more meat. Seizing my chance, I bound the end of my turban around one of the chunks of meat, tied the other end around my chest, and waited. Soon enough, a terrifying giant eagle swooped towards me, seized the meat in its talons, and flew up again. The claws pulled tight around my chest, and I was launched into the air. As I swung up above the cliff tops, I could see a group of men waiting with guns. When the men fired their guns, the eagle above me shrieked and let go of the meat. Along with the meat and a shower of diamonds, I plummeted down to the ground, landing with a thump that knocked the wind out of me. The men came to gather the diamonds. They were so shocked to see me that they fell over one another. "Where did you come from?" one asked. "It's a long story," I wheezed. "Why don't you come home with us?" suggested another. "You can tell us then." So later, in their little village up in the mountains, I told them everything. They all agreed it was the best story they'd ever heard. In the morning, I made my way to the nearest port. I asked around among the sailors, but nobody had ever heard of my homeland. So with one of my diamonds, I bought a ship and paid for a captain and crew to help me find my way home. It was a long voyage on which I saw many strange and wonderful things. Flying fish with funny faces, islands full of giant trees, and golden birds flying under the water. But the sight of my homeland was the most wonderful of all. I vowed to stay there for the rest of my days, but after a while, I began to long for more adventure. So I started to plan my next voyage. And Sinbad the sailor in total made 7 voyages. Thank you.